Mr Deputy Speaker. I acknowledge the contributions that have been made thus far from the shadow spokesman and now from the member for Barara. Let me say I appreciate his experience in this place and his role, as he described, in those years after the Whitlam government, and as an observer of matters to do with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs, and in particular in this instance, the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, Northern Territory 1976, that I do appreciate his observations. However, I think some of them may be a little bit misguided, and I'll come to that in a moment. Not misguided because of any fault of his, because I think there may be a lack of understanding of how the Act actually operates. Because it is clear, as we speak today, that under Section 19 of the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, Northern Territory 1976, it is possible, and people do, have leases, subleases, from Aboriginal freehold land to carry out all manner of activities. And these have been available since 1976. There's a plethora of economic activity happening on Aboriginal communities as we speak using this Section 19 lease. And it is possible, and it has been possible since 1976, for individuals to seek a lease for the purpose of building their own home under Section 19 of the Land Rights Act. And sadly, from one perspective, that has not happened. There hasn't been a large number of people seeking to lease land for the purpose of building their own homes. There are township leases at Niu. There are, under those township leases to the Commonwealth, there have been, I think, 3 or 4, maybe 5 individual homeowners. But the number of people with home ownership or seeking home ownership is small. And it's largely because of the economic environment in which people live. And their aspirations are, frankly, a little different from yours or mine. And I think it's also fair to observe, and I observe this as someone who comes from a family post-World War II, that it was commonplace, and indeed it was the thing for people to live in rented accommodation all their lives. My parents did. So it's not unusual to expect that people who currently live in rented government-provided accommodation should be happy to maintain that relationship with the government whilst they've got access to accommodation. As I say, my parents did this, and indeed I can point you to suburbs in Canberra today, which has been the case where people of my parents' generation are still renters. Now, I know that we say that all Australians should aspire to home ownership. Well, frankly, it's moving out of the reach of many, so I wouldn't be too hung up on that. But what I do want to emphasise is the importance of acknowledging that people can actually use this Act as it was meant to be used, as it was designed to be used, for leasing land for the purposes of economic development and economic activity. Nevertheless, this piece of legislation, I was never a great fan of the Office of Township Leasing, I've got to say, provides a capacity for subleases from the Office of Township Leasing to go to an individual corporation, and that's a good idea, because it means Aboriginal owners of land can form the corporations which then manage the subleases. Now, that's a very positive thing to do, and it leaves the Office of Township Leasing where it should be in Canberra, having very little to do with what goes on. Obviously, the arrangement for the Aboriginal Benefits Account to pay the costs associated with new leasing arrangements are important. And of course, there are 2 new parcels of land which I'll refer to later under the Act. And there is further amendments which the government has made which will bring the delegation of Land Council functions and powers in the Land Rights Act in line with standard practice and delegation arrangements, and improve the process for delegations. Now, it's important to understand the reason this has happened before because of government overreach. The objectives of amending this legislation to effectively mean that the minister could take away the delegated powers of the Land Council and provide them to an incorporation who was then not responsible was actually ludicrous. And so no wonder it was opposed by Aboriginal community organisations and Aboriginal land councils in the Northern Territory. And I might point out, just for the sake of those who are listening, not that there are that many because I know we're not being broadcast, that all of the Land Rights Acts in the Northern Territory affect my electorate and my electorate alone. So the Tiwi Land Council, the Underliagwa Land Council, the Central Land Council and the Northern Land Council all operate solely within my electorate. So it's important, I think, to understand that except for the provision of land, some land in Darwin, although the land under the Land Rights Act in the Cox Peninsula is part of my electorate, it's not part of the electorate of Solomon, that I've had a relationship with these land councils since prior to being elected to Parliament. Indeed, I worked for the Central Land Council immediately prior to being a candidate and being elected to this Parliament as their policy officer. So I understand and appreciate the importance of land councils and land rights in the Northern Territory. And indeed, I think for those who want to reflect upon our history in this regard, I think it's without doubt. And thank you to the Fraser government following on from the Whitlam government's drafting the legislation. Without doubt, the singular most important change to Aboriginal affairs in this country in the second half of the last century. No question. No question. Because it is the only piece of legislation, Commonwealth legislation, that's given statutory recognition to land rights much prior to native title, and for that those governments with so much foresight need to be applauded. And the land councils have carried out their roles diligently with a great deal of pressure at times from external organisations, from mining companies, from pastoralists and others over the years. Thankfully those attitudes have all changed. And the relationships that exist between mining companies, other developers, the pastoral industry and land councils in the Northern Territory is now a very positive one. I couldn't say the same for the late 1970s and early 1980s when there was a war of attrition. In 1985, when Mutijulu, when Uluru was handed back to the traditional owners as a result of a very insightful piece of work by the then ministers responsible, Clyde Holding as Minister for Aboriginal Affairs and Barry Cohen as Minister for the Environment, a very insightful arrangement was made because the Aboriginal traditional owners, the Pitjantjatjara and Yangatjarra people from that region, but principally the Pitjantjatjara and Yangatjarra people, they failed in their land claim bid for this area of land. The Commonwealth took the initiative and said, well, how about we create a national park, we give you the land, you lease it back to us for the purposes of the interests of all Australians, and you will get a benefit, direct benefit as a result. And the township, which is now under this legislation, will be excised out of the park for the purposes of administration. It was part of the national park, and that's been an issue since the enactment of the legislation, but most importantly since the transfer of title way back in 1985. And I was present at the handover, just as I was present recently at the 30th anniversary celebration. And I spoke at that celebration, and forgive me because I'm going to speak in Pitjantjatjara. Kulila, anango jota, visitor jota, ngā ko malpa jota, ngā lo pukulpa mulapa, Pijango Kuari, Iridi October 1985, Niri, Pulka Ngarangu, Ulurako Karajuraku, Ka Umwankara, Pukalaringu, Kuari, Nyanana, Piraku, Umwankara, Jungaringi, Puli Wiraku, Nyanana Pulkara, Kulingi, Mantaku, Mono Chukapaku, Mono Walcha. We are Ringuja, Kulu. Nyanana Pukopa, Mulaba Ka Ngalo Alaji Kulini. Puli pulka, puli wirupanya, nyaring choto, nyaring nyawa. Puli pulka nyaranyi, jurajara alajito, yurampa, umwankaraku palya. I was saying that I was present in 1985. I was happy to be there. I was happy to be at the recent celebration and how important this place was for Anangu people, for the Pitjantjatjara and Yangatjarra traditional owners. And I said at the end, because I remember this day vividly, when the land was handed over and the lease was handed back, there was a big sign, because there was opposition from the Northern Territory government. They didn't want to have this happen. There was quite an unbelievable opposition to this. And Yummy Lester, who was a principal involved at the time, got up the next day and said, look, it hasn't been taken away, it's still here. And so what I said here was, look, it's still here, and we're happy that it's still there. So it is important to acknowledge these past historical events and understand their importance to Australia. And I noted the contribution from the member for Barawa, and he's absolutely correct about its importance, the importance of us working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, in this case Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory, ensuring that they maintain control of their land and develop it in a way which suits their priorities, not necessarily ours. And I think what's hard for us, many of us, to understand is the cultural importance that people attach to their country, their attachment to it for law reasons, their attachment to us because of their traditional affiliation to that country, and the priority that culture has, which doesn't exist with us. Let's be very clear about it. And so when Aboriginal people talk about country, they talk about it differently. Their concept of ownership is very different from the one which we have, which is based on a statutory title. Theirs has been since time immemorial. No written document, but a body of law nevertheless. And people have understood what that law has meant and what it means in terms of succession. What happens when someone passes away? Who has the obligations for ceremony? Who owns the stories for that piece of land? How they connect to other pieces of land? These are of crucial importance. And even today we've got representatives, I think today, representatives from Wataka, Kings Canyon National Park, which is in the Central Land Council region south of Alice Springs, in Canberra, trying to stop gas exploration in the national park because it happens to be Crown land. Well, you know, the miners say, well, there, but some people want it. The fact is, the traditional owners are opposed to it, and they're opposed to it because of the sacredness of that country. And for a lot of Australians, sadly, they've yet to wake up to what that really means. It's not some blithe term, it's not some just, hear me out, this is my sacred country. They've got to understand the depth of that statement and what it means. And sadly, too many don't. So we're very fortunate to be able to be in this place, in my view, looking at this piece of legislation and acknowledging that as a result of this legislation there'll be 2 new parcels of land which are being now scheduled under the Land Rights Act. And these 2 new parcels of land, once I find their names, are important for those Aboriginal people. One of them, well, they're both places that I know, except I can't tell you their names because I can't find them. But nevertheless, one at Wickham area of the Simpson Desert, which is Schedule 1, and there is another which I can't find. But I will find it as I'm talking. I regard myself as being someone who's been very fortunate in life. Very fortunate that I've had the opportunity to live and work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people around the Northern Territory and indeed across Australia. I hope I've learnt something. I hope I've acknowledged the importance of their country and appreciate and help others to appreciate how we should properly deal with them as the traditional owners of this land of ours. And those 2, now I have the land, it's Ulperpa, which is a name given to country and people in a small area east of Santa Teresa, or Gingerperta. The Land Commissioner made no finding on the original land claim on the identity of traditional ownership, but recommended the area should be scheduled under the Act. The Wickham River land is in the Victoria River region to the northwest of Kalkaringi and south a little west of Timber Creek. Now that's really very important because Kalkaringi, of course, is the home of that great man Vincent Ligiari, who led that walk-off so many years ago and changed the psyche of Australians towards Aboriginal people and Aboriginal people in their land. Can I thank the government for presenting this legislation and assure it that we have got bipartisan support.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for